That evening, Charles Montgomery, a 39-year-old American billionaire with an empire built on luxury sports cars, drove his custom midnight blue Atlantic Motors Eclipse, a car so rare it was whispered about in elite circles. The coastal highway stretched before him, its sharp curves carved into the cliffs of California's Big Sur. The ocean, painted in shades of emerald and sapphire, shimmered under the waning sun. Charles tightened his grip on the leather steering wheel, the hum of the powerful engine drowning out the world. The road should have commanded his full attention, but his mind was miles away. Lately, even the thrill of driving his masterpiece, a car he personally designed, couldn't shake the restlessness brewing inside him. Atlantic Motors, his brainchild, had conquered the global market, coveted by Hollywood stars and tech tycoons alike. But the pursuit of perfection and the endless cycle of boardroom deals left him hollow. A soft tune from the car's stereo broke through his thoughts, a familiar melody from his childhood. The singer's voice, rich with emotion, crooned, "The treasures you seek are reflections of the love you avoid. Gold cannot fill a heart. Only love makes it whole." Charles exhaled sharply, his fingers tapping the steering wheel in rhythm with the song. It was as though the lyrics were meant for him, pointing out the emptiness he had carefully ignored. For all his wealth, for all his success, he couldn't deny it. Something vital was missing. As he rounded a bend, a movement in his peripheral vision pulled him back to the present. A flock of sheep meandered along a hillside, their bells jingling faintly in the wind. Distracted, Charles glanced at them for a moment, too long. When he turned back to the road, his heart lurched. Someone was directly in his path. Time seemed to slow. A young woman, her long dark braids swaying as she carried a basket of wildflowers, froze in the middle of the lane. Charles slammed the brakes, the Eclipse screeching as it veered. The tires skidded on the rain-slick pavement. Though the car narrowly missed her, the sudden movement caused the woman to stumble backward. Her basket flew from her hands and she fell, striking her head on the asphalt. The road became eerily silent, save for the patter of light rain beginning to fall. He leaped from the car, his pulse pounding in his ears. Kneeling beside her motionless figure, Charles felt a wave of panic unlike anything he'd ever known. Her dark lashes rested against pale cheeks, and her simple dress clung to her frail frame as the drizzle continued to dampen them both. "Miss," he called out, his voice cracking, "can you hear me? Please wake up." There was no response. Guilt clenched his chest as he gently lifted her into his arms. She felt impossibly light, her fragility contrasting sharply with the strength of the man carrying her. The wildflowers from her basket lay scattered across the road, vibrant and crushed. Sliding her carefully into the passenger seat of his car, Charles hesitated for a moment, taking in the stark contrast between the luxurious interior and the simplicity of her appearance. He couldn't shake the thought. How could my world of extravagance collide with hers so suddenly, so violently? With a shaky hand, he started the car and sped toward the nearest hospital, his focus now entirely on saving the life of the stranger whose path had crossed his in such a devastating way. Arriving at the hospital, Charles screeched to a halt outside the emergency room. The roar of the Eclipse caught the attention of hospital staff who rushed to assist. 2 nurses and a doctor approached the car, quickly transferring the unconscious woman to a stretcher. Charles followed closely, his designer loafers splashing in the puddles forming on the ground. She hit her head," he stammered to the doctor. "Please, just help her." His usual composed demeanor was gone, replaced by sheer desperation. As the medical team worked to stabilize her, Charles stood frozen, drenched and helpless. The rain had begun to pour harder, yet he didn't care. For the first time in years, nothing else mattered. Not the brand, not the image, not the empire he had built. This woman, whose name he didn't even know, had become the center of his world in an instant. Hours later, a nurse emerged, her expression neutral but calm. "Mr. Montgomery?" Charles nodded. "How is she?" "She suffered a serious head injury," the nurse began. "There's swelling in her brain, which we're monitoring closely. Right now, it's too early to say what the outcome will be. She's stable for the moment, but there's a chance of lasting complications." The weight of those words nearly buckled his knees. Charles muttered his thanks, unsure what else to say. The nurse hesitated before adding, "She's resting now. If you'd like, you can sit with her for a while." Charles followed the nurse through the quiet hospital corridors. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, and the faint hum of machines became louder as they approached her room. His heart raced with every step. When they arrived, he paused at the doorway. There she was, lying on the hospital bed, surrounded by a tangle of monitors and IV lines. Her long braid rested against the pillow, and her pale face was framed by the glow of soft lighting. Despite the beeping machines and the clinical environment, there was something peaceful about her presence. Charles took a tentative step into the room and lowered himself into the chair beside her bed. For a moment, he just sat there, unsure of what to do or say. His gaze lingered on her delicate features he would have never noticed in his usual fast-paced life. This stranger, whose world was so different from his, now held a piece of his heart. As he leaned closer, her eyelids fluttered faintly. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, she opened her eyes, blinking against the light. Her gaze landed on him, filled with confusion and faint alarm. "Where?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're in the hospital," Charles said softly, his voice unsteady. You had an accident. I... He hesitated, the guilt choking his words. "I'm so sorry. It's my fault. I should have been more careful." Her brow furrowed, and she looked away as if trying to piece together fragmented memories. The road, the rain. Her voice trailed off, her strength waning. "I wasn't looking either," she added, almost inaudibly. Her words struck him like a blow. Even now, in her fragile state, she was trying to shoulder the blame. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter what happened," he said firmly. "What matters is that you're going to be okay. And I promise I'll do whatever it takes to help you." The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Her eyes searched his, and though she didn't speak, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile connection born of shared vulnerability. Later that evening, the attending doctor called Charles into the hallway to discuss her condition. The doctor's tone was calm but grave. "She has a significant cranial injury," the doctor began. "The swelling has stabilized for now, but we need to watch for any changes. Recovery in these cases can be unpredictable. There could be lasting effects, or she could make a full recovery with time and care." Charles nodded, his throat tightening. He glanced back toward her room, the image of her fragile form etched into his mind. "Do whatever you need to," he said quietly. "Money is no object. Just save her." The doctor regarded him with a measured expression. "We'll do our best, Mr. Montgomery. But healing isn't something that money alone can buy. She'll need support, physically and emotionally." Those words stayed with him as he returned to her bedside. She was awake again, though her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. He sat down, his presence quiet but steadfast. "What's your name?" he asked gently. For a moment she didn't respond, as if weighing whether to trust him. Then her lips parted. "Lila," she whispered. "Lila Porter." Charles nodded, committing the name to memory. "Lila, I'm Charles Montgomery, and I'm the man who owes you an apology, and much more." A faint smile touched her lips, though it was tinged with weariness. "Well, Charles Montgomery," she said, her voice barely audible, "you saved me." "I suppose we're even." He let out a breathless chuckle, surprised by her lightness in such a moment. "Not even close," he replied. "But I'll make it up to you." I swear her eyes met his, and for the first time since the accident, a glimmer of trust passed between them. The following day, Charles arrived at the hospital with a bouquet of daisies and lavender, their gentle fragrance filling the room. Lila's face lit up at the sight, her fingers brushing the petals as he set the bouquet on the bedside table. "They're beautiful," she murmured. "Thank you." Charles hesitated, then spoke, his tone laced with sincerity. "It's the least I can do, and I meant what I said yesterday. Whatever you need, whatever will help you recover, I'll make it happen." Lila tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Even if it's something unusual?" "Anything," he promised, his voice firm. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. Then, with a quiet resolve, she said, "I have one wish, and I'm asking you to make it come true." "Name it," Charles said, leaning forward. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words hit him with the force of a gale. "Marry me." Charles blinked, stunned into silence. "Marry you?" he stammered, certain he'd misheard. "Yes," Lila said, her tone unwavering despite her frailty. If this is the end for me, I want to know what it's like to love and be loved. Even if it's just for a moment, even if it's only a gesture. Will you give me that?" Charles stared at her, his mind reeling. In his world, marriage was a transaction, a merger of assets or an exchange of power. But this was something entirely different. It wasn't about contracts or appearances. It was about a fleeting moment of connection, a wish born of vulnerability and hope. Finally he nodded, his voice steady, but his heart racing. "Yes," he said, "if that's what you want, I'll do it." The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation, though unlike anything Charles had ever experienced. There were no lavish planners, no grand ballrooms booked, no designer fittings or exclusive guest lists. This was simple, intimate, and deeply personal. A quiet ceremony to fulfill a fragile wish. On the morning of the wedding, Charles arrived at the hospital carrying a small velvet box and a bouquet of white roses. His usual confident demeanor was replaced by a nervous energy that made him fidget with his cuffs. When he stepped into Lila's room, he paused, momentarily taken aback. Lila sat propped up on the hospital bed, her dark braid draped over one shoulder. One of the nurses had helped her into a simple white dress, delicate and soft, flowing lightly around her thin frame. A sheer veil framed her pale face, and though her body was frail, her eyes sparkled with a quiet determination. "You look," Charles began, his voice faltering. He swallowed and tried again. "You look beautiful, Lila." She smiled, faint but genuine. "And you look nervous," she teased softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. He laughed, the sound a little unsteady. "I'm not used to this," he admitted, "but I'll do my best." The room had been transformed for the occasion. The nurses had strung up fairy lights along the walls, and a small bouquet of wildflowers rested on the bedside table, next to the medical monitors. A kind-hearted chaplain from the hospital stood by, ready to officiate. Two nurses, visibly moved by the story, had volunteered to be witnesses. Charles approached the bed, his hands trembling as he held the velvet box out to her. "I brought you this," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single sapphire. "It's not flashy, but it reminded me of you. Simple, elegant." Lila's fingers brushed the ring lightly, her smile growing. "It's perfect," she whispered. The chaplain cleared his throat gently, signaling that it was time to begin. Charles stood close to Lila's bedside, his towering figure a stark contrast to her delicate frame. Yet as they exchanged vows, there was an undeniable connection between them, a bond that transcended the brief time they had known each other. "I, Charles Montgomery, take you, Lila Porter, to be my wife," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "In sickness and in health, for as long as you'll have me." Lila's gaze held his as she responded, her voice soft but unwavering. "And I, Lila Porter, take you, Charles Montgomery, to be my husband. For this moment, for this life, for however long it may last. When the chaplain pronounced them husband and wife, Charles leaned down, brushing a gentle kiss against her forehead. The room fell silent save for the soft hum of the monitors and the quiet rustle of the bouquet resting in her lap. The days following their wedding were filled with an unexpected peace. Though Lila remained weak, her spirit seemed lighter, as if the burden of her fear had been replaced by a quiet joy. Charles, too, found himself changed. For the first time in years, his focus shifted entirely from his empire to another person. He brought books to read aloud to her, stories of adventure and romance. He arranged for soft music to play in the room, selecting melodies that seemed to calm her and brighten her smile. And he sat with her for hours, sharing fragments of his own life, memories he hadn't spoken of in years. One afternoon, as the sunlight streamed through the window, Charles turned to Lila with a question that had been weighing on him. "Why did you ask me to marry you?" he asked, his tone curious but gentle. Lila tilted her head, her expression contemplative. "Because I wanted to feel something real," she said. "In my life I've had so little. I grew up with dirt under my nails, tending to a garden that barely grew. My world was small and my dreams were simple. But love was something I never thought I'd find." Her eyes met his and she smiled faintly. "I knew I might not have much time left. And you, Charles, you gave me hope. Not for a future, but for a moment. That's all I wanted." Charles was silent for a long time, her words settling deep within him. Finally he reached out and took her hand, his voice low and full of resolve. "You'll have more than a moment, Lila. I'll make sure of it." Weeks passed, and against all odds Lila's health began to improve. The swelling in her brain subsided, and she slowly regained her strength. The doctors, who had once been cautious with their optimism, began to speak of a full recovery. On the day Lila was discharged, Charles was there to escort her from the hospital. He had arranged for her to stay in his sprawling estate, a place of modern luxury perched on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean. But as they approached the sleek black car waiting outside, Lila hesitated. "Charles," she began, her voice steady but quiet, I can't go with you." He turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "I need to go back to my home, to my life. It's where I belong." "But you don't have to go back to that life," Charles said, his voice filled with urgency. "You could have everything you need with me. You wouldn't have to worry about anything." Lila shook her head gently. "It's not about what I have, Charles. It's about who I am. My roots are in that small house, in the garden I tended with my own hands. That's where my heart is. And if I lose that, I lose myself." Charles looked at her, struggling to understand. For a man who had spent his life building and acquiring, the idea of choosing simplicity over abundance was foreign. But as he gazed into Lila's eyes, he saw the quiet conviction there, the strength of someone who knew her own soul. Finally, he nodded. "If that's what you want, Lila, I'll take you home." The journey back to Lila's small home in the countryside was quiet, with the hum of the car's engine filling the silence between them. Charles stole glances at her in the passenger seat, her face calm as she gazed out the window. She seemed at peace, and yet he couldn't shake the ache in his chest. He had thought their wedding marked the beginning of something new, but now it felt like the start of a goodbye. As they pulled up to the house, a modest one-story with a porch that leaned slightly to the left, Charles couldn't help but feel out of place. The contrast between her world and his was stark. Yet, in the simplicity of the little garden out front and the wind chime that jingled softly in the breeze, there was a beauty he couldn't deny. Lila stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath of the crisp air. "This is it," she said softly, a small smile playing on her lips. "Home." Charles followed her up the creaking steps, carrying the overnight bag she insisted on packing herself. Inside, the house was exactly as he had imagined, warm, unpretentious, and filled with small, thoughtful touches that spoke of Lila's care. A patchwork quilt lay draped over the worn sofa, and the walls were adorned with family photos and pressed flowers in wooden frames. Lila turned to him, her hands clasped in front of her. "Thank you, Charles, for everything." He set the bag down and met her gaze. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice low. I don't want to leave you here alone." "I won't be alone," she replied gently. "This place has always been enough for me." Charles's brow furrowed. "But it doesn't have to be. Lila, I could give you the world." She smiled, stepping closer and placing a hand on his chest. "You already did. You gave me something no one else ever has. Your time, your kindness, your heart. And that means more to me than all the wealth in the world." He covered her hand with his throat tightening. "Then let me stay," he said quietly, "just for a while, until I'm sure you're okay." Lila hesitated, her gaze searching his. Finally she nodded. "All right," she said, "just for a while." The days that followed were a revelation for Charles. Life on Lila's small plot of land was nothing like the whirlwind of meetings, deadlines, and luxury events that had defined his world. Here the hours stretched long and quiet, marked by the rhythm of simple tasks. Lila showed him how to tend the garden, her hands moving deftly as she pulled weeds and turned the soil. Charles fumbled at first, the rich earth unfamiliar beneath his manicured nails. But he found an unexpected satisfaction in the work, the physicality grounding him in a way he hadn't felt before. They spent evenings on the porch, the sunset painting the horizon in hues of gold and crimson. Lila would sip tea from a chipped mug, while Charles, uncharacteristically, found himself lost in thought. He began to wonder if all his wealth and power had been a distraction, a way to fill the emptiness he hadn't even realized was there. One evening, as the stars began to dot the sky, Lila turned to him. "You're different here," she said, her voice soft. Charles glanced at her, startled. "What do you mean?" "You seem lighter," she said, "like you've let go of something you were carrying." He thought about her words, about the weight he had always felt pressing on his chest. "Maybe I have," he admitted. "Being here, with you, it's changed me." Lila smiled, her eyes shimmering in the moonlight. "Sometimes we don't realize how much we're missing until we find it." As the weeks turned into months, Charles and Lila settled into a quiet rhythm. Her health continued to improve and the color returned to her cheeks. Charles, too, found himself transformed. The restless ambition that had once driven him now felt distant, replaced by a newfound contentment. One day, as they worked side by side in the garden, Charles paused, leaning on his spade. "Lila," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I've been thinking." She looked up from where she was planting a row of marigolds, her brow lifting in curiosity. "About what?" "About staying," he said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. "Not just for now, but for good." Lila's hand stilled, her expression unreadable. "Charles, your life is out there," she said gently. "You've built something incredible. You can't just leave it behind." He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Maybe I can. Maybe I want to. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. And that's here, with you." Tears glistened in Lila's eyes, and she reached out, taking his hands in hers. "Are you sure?" she whispered. He nodded, his voice firm. "I've never been more sure of anything." In the years that followed, Charles and Lila built a life together on her little patch of land. The mansion overlooking the Pacific was sold, the proceeds donated to charities that supported rural communities and small farmers, an idea Lila had inspired in him. Charles never looked back. The garden they tended together flourished, a testament to the love and partnership they had cultivated. And though their life was simple, it was rich in ways he had never imagined. Lila often said that love had saved her, but Charles knew the truth. It was she who had saved him. She had shown him that the true treasures of life weren't found in luxury or power, but in the quiet moments shared with someone who made you feel whole. And in the end, it wasn't the world he had given her, but his heart. And for both of them, that was more than enough. Charles Montgomery had spent his life surrounded by luxury and acclaim. Every detail of his existence, from the exotic cars to the opulent galas, was a declaration to the world of his success. But now, standing before Lila Porter on the porch of a humble farmhouse, with the sun casting golden hues across the rolling hills behind her, everything he once valued seemed trivial in the face of a newfound truth. "I don't need more time to understand," he said, kneeling before her and holding the ring she had returned. His eyes, steady yet filled with emotion, sought hers. "I love you, Lila, not out of guilt, not out of remorse. I love you because you've changed my life. You've shown me what it truly means to live, what it means to love without expecting anything in return. With you, I found the peace I didn't even know I was searching for. You are my home, Lila. And now I'm the one asking you, will you be my wife, truly and forever?" Lila stared at him, overwhelmed by the intensity of his words, and her eyes began to fill with tears. She, who had learned to find joy in life's simplest moments, had never expected to hear such a declaration. Silently, she nodded, and then she threw herself into his arms. In that embrace, their worlds, so different, so opposite, finally found a place to merge. For the first time, both felt whole. They had found in each other what they hadn't realized they'd been missing. Beneath the warm glow of the sunset, with the hills as witnesses, Charles and Lila sealed a bond that needed nothing more than their love to be eternal. The days that followed were filled with teamwork and small moments of joy. Charles, who had spent his life in meetings and high-profile events, now found himself repairing the garden fence or harvesting tomatoes alongside Lila. Each task, however simple, brought him a satisfaction he had never experienced before. One afternoon, as they washed carrots in a bucket near the well, Charles glanced up at Lila. Her face was bathed in the soft light of the late afternoon sun, and her hands, though small and delicate, bore the strength of someone who had worked tirelessly with love and dedication. "Lila?" he said suddenly, breaking the silence. She looked up, curious. "I've been thinking. This place is special, but I think we can make it even more ours. What if we expand the farm, maybe plant more crops or even raise animals?" Lila blinked, surprised by his enthusiasm. Then she smiled, her expression full of tenderness. "Charles, this is our home now," she replied softly. "Whatever we do, we'll do it together." His heart swelled at her words. For a man who had once been consumed by ambition and material gain, the idea of building something simple and meaningful with her was more fulfilling than any deal he had ever closed. As their life together began to flourish, word of Charles's new path spread quickly. Articles in business magazines questioned his decisions, labeling him a fallen titan who had turned his back on the world of power and prestige. Old acquaintances whispered about his escape, and even Bianca Regina, his ex-fiancée, made a scathing public statement, dismissing his life as a romanticized delusion. Charles, however, remained resolute. "Let them talk," he told Lila one evening as they sat on the porch. "For the first time in my life, I don't care what anyone thinks." But Lila, ever perceptive, saw the shadow of doubt flicker in his eyes. She reached over and gently took his hand, her touch grounding him. "The world will always have its opinions, Charles," she said, "but the people who matter will see the truth. And the truth is, you're more of a man now than you've ever been." Her words stayed with him, a balm for his lingering insecurities. Together they continued to nurture their growing farm, and with it, their shared dream. Months later their farm saw its first true harvest. It was modest but abundant. the result of months of hard work and collaboration. The garden was overflowing with fresh vegetables, and the small vineyard they had planted together yielded its first batch of grapes. To celebrate, they invited a handful of neighbors and friends to a simple dinner beneath the stars. A long wooden table was set up in the yard, adorned with wildflowers and flickering candles. As everyone gathered around, Leila raised her glass, her voice clear and strong. "To life," she said, her smile radiant, "to love, and to finding joy in the simplest things." Charles watched her, his heart swelling with pride. She had given him a new purpose, a new sense of belonging, and he silently vowed to spend the rest of his life ensuring she felt the same. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves began to turn, Leila approached Charles with a look of wonder on her face. Her hands trembled slightly, and her voice quivered with excitement. "I have something to tell you," she said. "What is it?" he asked, setting down the tools he had been using to repair the chicken coop. Leila hesitated for a moment, then broke into a smile, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Charles was speechless, his mind racing to comprehend the magnitude of her words. Then, slowly, a wide grin spread across his face, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. "We're going to be parents," he whispered, his voice thick with awe. The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. Together they painted the nursery, read parenting books, and dreamed of the life they would create for their child, a life rooted in love, simplicity, and the values they had discovered together. Years later, the farm had become a thriving community hub. Families visited to pick fresh produce, children played among the animals, and neighbors gathered for seasonal festivals. Charles and Leila's love had become the heart of the farm, inspiring everyone who passed through. Their child, a spirited little girl with Leila's warm smile and Charles's determination, grew up immersed in the beauty of nature and the strength of her parents' bond. She learned the value of hard work, the importance of kindness, and the simple joy of sharing a meal with loved ones. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, Charles turned to Leila. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but full of emotion. Leila tilted her head, puzzled. "For what?" "For saving me," he said. "For showing me what really matters." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You saved yourself, Charles. I just showed you the way." As the stars filled the sky, they sat in comfortable silence, their hearts full and their souls at peace. Together, they had built a life that was rich not in possessions, but in love, a legacy that would last for generations. The farm had grown into something far beyond what either Charles or Leila had imagined. It wasn't just a home or a source of sustenance. It was a sanctuary, a place where the community gathered to celebrate the seasons and share in the fruits of the earth. On Saturdays, children ran through the fields, picking strawberries or helping collect eggs, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Elderly neighbors shared stories by the fire pit, sipping cider, while younger families traded recipes and advice. The farm had become a tapestry of lives intertwined, bound by love, generosity, and the land that sustained them all. One such evening, during a harvest festival under a sky filled with stars, Charles stood at the center of the crowd. Lanterns hung from trees, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Tables laden with dishes made from the farm's bounty stretched across the yard. Leila, glowing with happiness, stood beside him, holding their daughter's hand. As the festivities quieted, Charles raised his glass. "To this land," he began, his voice steady but rich with emotion, "and to the people who have made it what it is. You have shown me something that no amount of wealth or power ever could, the strength of a true community." His gaze swept the crowd, finally settling on Leila. "And to my wife, who has given me the greatest gifts of all, love, purpose, and a family. Everything I have, everything I am, is because of you." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and as Charles pulled Lila into a gentle embrace, their daughter clapped her hands with delight. It was a moment of pure joy, a celebration of the life they had built together. Despite the success of their new life, challenges inevitably arose. One winter, an unexpected storm struck, damaging the barn and flooding part of the fields. Crops were lost, and the repair costs loomed large. Charles, used to solving problems with a simple phone call or a check, found himself faced with a more complex reality. "We'll figure this out," Leila said, her voice calm but resolute as they surveyed the damage. "We always do." Charles nodded, her unwavering confidence steadying him. Together, they worked tirelessly to rebuild. Neighbors pitched in, lending tools, labor, and expertise. Slowly but surely the farm recovered, not just because of Charles and Lila's efforts, but because of the community they had nurtured. In the end, the experience only deepened Charles's understanding of the values Lila had taught him: resilience, collaboration, and the beauty of relying on others when times were tough. One crisp spring morning, as Charles was repairing a fence at the edge of the property, a sleek black car pulled up the driveway. The sight of it sent a ripple of unease through him. It was the kind of car he once would have owned, the kind that symbolized a life he had left behind. From the car stepped Bianca Regina Novelli, her presence as striking as ever. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, she carried herself with the same commanding confidence that had once captivated him. But as she approached, Charles noticed something different in her expression: curiosity, tinged with something softer. "Charles," she said, her voice smooth but hesitant, "it's been a long time." He set down his tools and wiped his hands on his jeans, standing to meet her. "Bianca," he said, his tone polite but guarded, "what brings you here?" She looked around, her eyes taking in the fields, the house, and the simplicity of the life he now led. "I had to see it for myself," she admitted. "The articles, the rumors, none of it made sense. You, of all people, giving up everything for this?" Charles's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Lila appeared, carrying a basket of freshly picked vegetables. Her smile faltered slightly as she noticed Bianca, but she walked over, her posture calm and welcoming. "And you must be Lila," Bianca said, her tone cool but curious. "I am," Lila replied, extending a hand. "Welcome to our farm." For a moment, Bianca seemed taken aback by Lila's grace, by the quiet confidence she exuded, despite the obvious contrast in their worlds. She shook Lila's hand, then turned back to Charles. "I'll admit I didn't understand it before, but now I think I see what you found here." Charles nodded, his expression softening. "It's not about what I gave up, Bianca. It's about what I gained." Bianca's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she offered a faint smile. "Then I hope you're happy, Charles." "Truly." With that, she returned to her car and drove away, leaving Charles and Lila standing side by side. Lila turned to him, her smile warm. "You okay?" she asked gently. Charles slipped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "More than okay," he said. "I've never been better." Years later, the farm had become a beacon of hope and inspiration for countless others. Charles and Leila had turned it into a sustainable haven, hosting workshops on farming, sustainability, and building community. Their story had spread, drawing visitors who came not just to learn about the land, but to witness the love that had transformed two lives. Their daughter, now a spirited teenager, worked alongside them, her laughter echoing across the fields. She dreamed of expanding the farm's reach, of using it to help others in need. Her parents encouraged her, proud of the strong, compassionate young woman she was becoming. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch watching the sunset, Charles turned to Lila, his hand resting on hers. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Lila tilted her head, her expression puzzled. "For what?" "For showing me a different way to live," he replied. "For showing me what really matters." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You always had it in you, Charles. You just needed to slow down long enough to see it." As the stars began to twinkle above, their daughter ran up, holding a jar of fireflies she had caught. "Look, Mama! Look, Papa!" she exclaimed, her face glowing with excitement. Charles and Lila smiled. Their hands entwined as they watched their daughter's joy. In that moment, beneath the vast expanse of the sky, they knew they had built something truly lasting, a life rooted in love, purpose, and the quiet beauty of simply being together. As the years passed, Charles and Lila's life became a tapestry of challenges and triumphs, each thread woven with love and perseverance. Their farm, now a cornerstone of the community, flourished not just because of its bounty, but because of the connections it fostered. One summer evening, as a warm breeze drifted through the open windows of their home, Charles sat by the kitchen table, sketching plans for a new greenhouse. Lila entered the room, carrying a tray with 2 glasses of iced tea. She set it down and leaned over his shoulder, her chin brushing lightly against his. "Still working on that," she teased gently, her voice soft and familiar. Charles turned to her with a smile. "You know me. Once I get an idea, I can't let it go." Lila slid into the seat beside him, her hand finding his. "You've always been that way," she said with a grin. "It's one of the things I love about you." Charles's gaze softened. He set down his pencil and turned to face her fully. "And you're the reason I've learned to put those ideas to good use." Their daughter, now a lively teenager with a boundless curiosity about the world, appeared in the doorway. "What are you two being all mushy about now?" she asked with a playful smirk. Charles chuckled, reaching out to ruffle her hair. "Just your mom reminding me why I'm the luckiest man alive." The girl rolled her eyes dramatically but smiled, her love for her parents shining through. "Well, if you're done being sappy, can we go down to the lake? The fireflies are out, and I want to catch some before it gets too dark." Lila and Charles exchanged a glance, both knowing they couldn't resist her enthusiasm. "Let's go," Lila said, grabbing a light shawl from the back of her chair. "But I'm warning you, I'm still the best firefly catcher in this family." The 3 of them walked down the familiar path toward the lake, their laughter mingling with the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, and the first stars began to appear. When they reached the lake, their daughter dashed ahead, jar in hand, her giggles echoing across the water. Lila and Charles followed at a leisurely pace, their hands intertwined. "You know," Charles said, his voice thoughtful, "I used to think moments like these weren't worth much. I thought happiness came from bigger, louder things. Parties, deals, accomplishments." Lila turned to him, her eyes twinkling in the fading light. "And now I know better," he replied. "This, being here with you and her, this is everything." Lila squeezed his hand, her smile warm. "Sometimes it takes losing yourself to find what really matters." They sat on the edge of the lake, their daughter darting around them, her jar glowing with captured fireflies. Charles leaned back, the cool grass beneath him, and the vast sky above. Lila rested her head on his shoulder, her contentment mirroring his. For the first time in years, he felt completely at peace. As their daughter grew, Charles and Lila began to think about the future of the farm. It had become more than a livelihood, it was a legacy. They decided to create programs that would teach young people the values of sustainable farming, community building, and compassion for the land. One spring, they opened the farm's doors to a group of students from a nearby city. The teenagers arrived with curiosity and skepticism, but by the end of the week they had learned to plant seeds, care for animals, and even cook meals with fresh produce from the garden. During the farewell dinner, one of the students stood up and said, "Thank you for showing us that life doesn't have to be about rushing or competing. Here, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years." Charles and Lila exchanged a glance. their hearts swelling with pride. The farm had become more than a sanctuary for their family. It was a place where others could find healing and purpose too. One chilly autumn evening, years later, Charles sat on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The leaves had turned vibrant shades of red and gold, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. Lila joined him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Our daughter's coming home for the Harvest Festival," she said, her smile tinged with excitement. "She said she's bringing someone special." Charles raised an eyebrow, his grin playful. "Do you think it's serious?" Lila laughed, nudging his shoulder. "We'll see. But I trust her judgment. She's got a good heart." When their daughter arrived a few days later, the farm buzzed with life. She introduced her partner, a kind-eyed man who shared her passion for the land. As they walked through the fields together, Charles felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The seeds they had planted, both in the soil and in their daughter, had flourished. In their later years, Charles and Lila watched as their daughter took over the farm, infusing it with new ideas while honoring the traditions they had built. The farm continued to grow, touching more lives and bringing more people together. One quiet evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lila turned to Charles. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The old life?" Charles shook his head, his smile serene. "Not for a second. This is the life I was meant to live, with you." She leaned against him, their love as strong as ever. Together they had built not just a farm, but a legacy, a testament to the power of love, resilience, and finding joy in life's simplest moments. And as the stars began to fill the sky, they knew their story would continue to grow, rooted in the land they had nurtured and the love they had shared.